She didn't say it in a fight. That's what made it land harder. We were standing near the training floor after a quarterly briefing, the kind with bad coffee and polite applause. People were still around. Not close enough to stare, close enough to hear. She adjusted her blazer, smiled like she was teaching a workshop, and said that if I wanted touch again, I should try earning it. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked past me. The man standing beside her nodded, slow and thoughtful, like he'd just heard something reasonable. His name was Mark Reynolds, external business coach. The guy the company brought in when they wanted alignment, culture, leadership language. I'd quoted him before, recommended his sessions to my crew. I respected him. That was the first cut. Quiet. Clean. No one laughed. No one reacted. It slid into the air and stayed there, unfinished. She moved on to another conversation, already correcting someone else's phrasing, already in her element. I stayed where I was, hands at my sides, radio clipped to my belt. I ran a shift with 300 people and heavy equipment that could kill you if you missed a step. I was used to pressure, used to responsibility. I wasn't used to being graded at home. She came back later, voice light, as if nothing had happened. She asked about my schedule, suggested dinner later in the week, mentioned how tired I'd been lately, how effort mattered. It sounded like feedback. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I nodded the same way I nodded when an operator acknowledged a safety protocol. Neutral. Contained. That night, I picked up an extra shift. Not as a statement. As a decision. The plan at night was predictable. Steel, noise, order. No subtext. No tests. You did the work, or you didn't. Results spoke. Silence was normal there. I came home after midnight. The house was dark except for the light in her office. She was on her laptop, probably correcting someone's behavior, probably proud of it. She glanced up, waiting for something from me. I gave her nothing. I showered, set my alarm, and slept like someone who had already stepped out of the room, even though his body was still inside it. By morning, the exam had already ended. She just didn't know she was the one who failed. The shift rotation changed a week later. Not because I asked for it, because I stopped adjusting my life around hers. I took every open overnight slot, every weekend coverage gap. I volunteered for audits on the secondary site across the river, the one no one liked because the hours were brutal and the commute ate your day. Management noticed. They always do when someone stops negotiating. She noticed too, just not right away. At home, the rhythm broke. Meals stopped lining up. Weekends went quiet. I wasn't unavailable. I was present in fragments. Boots by the door. Truck in the driveway at odd hours. A body moving through the house without attachment. She tried tone first. Casual remarks about balance. About burnout. About how high performers sometimes forget the people who support them. She said it like advice she'd give a client, not like a wife talking to her husband. I acknowledged it without responding. The next time Mark Reynolds came up, it wasn't accidental. She mentioned him over dinner one night. I actually made it home before 10. She talked about his clarity, his discipline, how rare it was to see a man comfortable in his authority without being defensive. She said people listened to him because he'd earned it. I kept eating. She watched me then, waiting for something. A reaction. A shift in posture. I didn't give her that either. I cleared my plate, checked my phone, and told her I had an early start. Later that week, I saw Mark's car in our driveway. Not late. Early evening. Still light out. Still normal enough that it could pretend to be professional. I didn't slow down when I passed. I didn't stop. I took the company truck back to the site and stayed there until my shift started. When I came home the next morning, his car was gone. The house smelled different. Not wrong. Just rearranged. She didn't bring it up. Neither did I. From that point on, things became efficient. She organized her calendar more tightly. I organized my life around work. I transferred officially to the secondary object. New badge access. New chain of command. Less overlap. She framed it as temporary. As a phase. As something we'd review. I didn't correct her. The plant had a way of stripping things down. Noise, light, motion. You couldn't fake consistency there. You either showed up steady or you washed out. I showed up steady. At home, she began performing concern. Asking if I was okay. Touching my arm briefly, like a reminder of a resource she assumed was still hers. I didn't pull away. I also didn't move closer. The space between us wasn't distance. It was something firmer. Something set. She thought the test was ongoing. I had already stopped taking it. The proof didn't arrive dramatically. No confession. No explosion. It came in pieces, the way operational failures always do. Small deviations. Overlaps that didn't make sense unless you stopped pretending. The first thing was the calendar. Not what was written, but what disappeared. Blocks of time marked as development sessions that never showed up on invoices. Client meetings that moved locations without explanation. Her phone face down more often. Notifications silenced when she used to leave everything open. I didn't check it right away. I let the pattern finish forming. At work, Mark Reynolds' name started circulating differently. Not as a visiting expert, but as someone who stayed late. Someone who needed private rooms. Someone whose access badge suddenly worked in places it hadn't before. I signed off on a facility's request without comment. Temporary workspace allocation. Executive discretion. It went through my system. I approved it the same way I approved machinery maintenance. No emotion, just procedure. The next piece came from finance. A reimbursement flagged wrong. Dinner, 2 people, submitted as client engagement. The location was too close to my house to be coincidence. The timing matched one of my overnight shifts. I didn't print anything. I didn't forward emails. I didn't confront anyone. I started closing doors instead. I rerouted my direct deposit to a new account. Updated beneficiaries. Canceled joint subscriptions that auto-renewed under my name. Changed my schedule permanently, not as coverage, but as assignment. The kind that required a signature and a new supervisor. At home, she became more attentive. Not warmer, sharper. Watching for changes the way consultants do when they sense resistance. She adjusted her tone. Reduced critique. Increased reassurance. She touched me once in the kitchen, longer than before. A hand on my back. Pressure meant to ground me. I stayed still. Not rigid. Neutral. Later that night, I saw Mark again. Not his car this time. His reflection in the hallway mirror as I walked past her office. He was on her screen, smiling in that calibrated way he had. Comfortable. Certain. She angled the laptop when she noticed me. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She asked if everything was okay. I told her I was tired. That answer satisfied her more than truth ever would have. I packed a go bag the next morning. Not in secret. In sequence. Work clothes. Personal documents. Chargers. No rush. I left it in the truck. The last thing I did before heading out was disable shared location services. Not dramatically, just quietly unavailable. She was still asleep when I left. By the time she woke up, the system she thought she was managing had already been taken offline. I didn't vanish all at once. That would have been theatrical. Predictable. I narrowed. First, the hours. Then the access. Then the responses. Messages delivered but unanswered. Calls returned late, clipped, functional. The kind of communication you use with vendors, not family. The transfer went through on a Monday. New object. New gate. New parking pass. The schedule locked me into 12-hour rotations that overlapped with nothing she ran. Management framed it as trust. I accepted it as distance. She noticed when my card stopped working at the main facility. She asked if something had changed. I told her operations had shifted. She asked if that meant less time together. I said it meant consistency. That was the first time her voice caught. By Wednesday, she started calling instead of texting. Not angry. Not pleading. Checking. She left one message asking if I was okay. Another saying she missed how we used to talk at night. A third reminding me we had a weekend planned that I hadn't acknowledged. I didn't correct her. The weekend had been removed from my calendar weeks ago. I stayed on site between shifts. Slept in the crew quarters. Ate what was available. The place stripped life down to necessity. There was relief in that. No interpretation required. From there, I watched. Her activity spiked. Messages sent and deleted. Calls made, then rerouted. She checked my location twice before realizing it wasn't visible anymore. That realization hit harder than anger. It meant loss of reference. Mark Reynolds stopped coming by the house. Not because he disappeared, because she needed him somewhere else. Neutral ground. Offices. Hotels near the freeway. Places that didn't remember. I heard about it indirectly. Systems talk if you know how to listen. Schedules adjust. Requests reroute. Someone asks why access was revoked sooner than planned. I didn't ask questions. I signed what needed signing. Friday night. She showed up at the secondary object gate. Not dramatic. No makeup. No performance. Just her car idling where it wasn't supposed to be. Security called me down because my name was on her lips. I didn't go. I watched the camera feed instead. Her posture changed minute by minute. Confidence first. Then irritation. Then something closer to uncertainty. She wasn't used to waiting without feedback. She left after 20 minutes. That was the moment she understood this wasn't silence as leverage. It was silence as removal. I went back to the floor, cleared a backlog, signed off on a maintenance cycle that would run through the weekend. When I finally slept, it wasn't escape. It was alignment. By the time she realized I wasn't pulling away to be chased, but stepping aside permanently, the space between us had already hardened into something she couldn't negotiate with. And for the first time since she'd turned closeness into a test, she had no scorecard left to hold. The shift against him didn't look like a move. That was the point. Mark Reynolds didn't fall because of jealousy or exposure. He fell because systems don't tolerate excess once the spotlight moves. And I knew where the spotlight would drift if nothing blocked it. The secondary object was overdue for an external review. Safety metrics were clean, productivity high, culture reports glowing. The kind of place executives like to point at when they need proof of progress. Mark had positioned himself close to that narrative. Workshops, closed-door sessions, strategic alignment meetings that somehow always ran long. I didn't flag him. I adjusted process. Badge access was tightened across all consulting roles. Not his name, just a policy revision. Vendor presence limited to scheduled hours. Private room usage required justification codes instead of courtesy approvals. Finance started asking for clearer categorization on engagements that blurred into personal time. None of it had my signature alone. That would have been obvious. It moved through committees, risk management, compliance. Slow enough to look organic. Clean enough to survive scrutiny. Mark adapted at first. He always did. Confidence covers a lot when doors still open. Then one didn't. Then another. Invoices started bouncing back for clarification. HR asked why development outcomes weren't measurable. Leadership asked why a consultant needed such broad access if results were already embedded. He wasn't accused. He was inconvenienced. At home, she felt it before he did. Her calls shifted tone again. Less control. More urgency. She asked if I'd heard anything about changes upstairs. Said people were tense. Said Mark seemed distracted. Said leadership had started asking strange questions. I told her operations evolve. She asked if I thought she should be worried. I said nothing. The house felt different when I finally stopped by to collect the rest of my things. Quieter, but not calmer. Papers stacked where they didn't need to be. A mug left in the sink, untouched. She followed me room to room without speaking, like someone watching inventory disappear. She didn't mention him. She didn't need to. 2 weeks later, Mark's contract was paused pending review. Not terminated. Not dramatic. Just suspended long enough to break momentum. Long enough for other names to surface. He called me once. Left a message that sounded professional. Confused. Asked if I knew what was happening. I didn't return it. By the time he realized the authority he'd borrowed no longer shielded him, it was already gone. Reputation doesn't shatter loudly. It erodes quietly, one unanswered email at a time. She tried to lean on me then. Not physically. Structurally. Asking for reassurance. For grounding. For the steadiness she used to assume was permanent. I was still steady. Just no longer oriented toward her. And when the man she'd chosen as a measure began slipping out of reach, she was left staring at the space I used to occupy, finally understanding the cost of turning respect into leverage. The social shift didn't announce itself. It crept in the way temperature changes do, noticed only when it's already uncomfortable. It started at a departmental mixer I wasn't supposed to attend. Secondary object leadership wanted visibility, and my name had weight there now. I showed up late, stayed near the edge, listened more than I spoke. She arrived after me. Not with Mark. Alone. That was new. Her posture was still composed, but her timing was off. She entered conversations too early, lingered too long. The ease she used to have around people who deferred to her was gone. She compensated by talking more, explaining more, correcting things no one had asked her to fix. People noticed. Someone asked about Mark. Not directly. Casually. The way professionals do when they're checking alignment without committing to concern. She smiled and said he was transitioning. That word used to work for her. This time it didn't land. Another consultant stepped in, younger, quieter, already embedded. Someone from HR shifted the topic toward internal capability building. The room moved on without waiting for her. I watched it happen without engaging. Not as punishment, as confirmation. Later that week, I heard from someone in finance that a dinner she'd submitted months earlier had been reclassified. No accusation, just adjustment. She lost a reimbursement she'd assumed was automatic. The email tone was polite, distant. At home, the isolation tightened. Friends she used to debrief with stopped calling as often. Not out of loyalty to me, out of discomfort. Her certainty had cracked, and people avoid standing near unstable narratives. She tried to pull me back into public view, suggested events, mentioned appearances, framed it as unity. I declined without explanation. She went alone instead. That's when the questions started turning outward. Not confrontational. Curious. Someone asked if we were doing okay. Someone else mentioned I'd been missed at a gathering. The phrasing changed from inclusion to observation. One night, she came home earlier than usual. Sat across from me at the table without opening her laptop. No agenda. No coaching tone. She said she felt like people were pulling away. I didn't disagree. She said it felt sudden. I didn't correct her. What she didn't understand was that distance doesn't begin when someone leaves. It begins when they stop investing socially on your behalf. When your name no longer travels attached to theirs. When rooms stop adjusting to your presence. I still moved easily through those rooms. Not because I explained anything. Because I didn't need to. By the end of the month, her calendar looked full, but her invitations didn't stick. Appearances without anchors. Conversations without follow-ups. She hadn't been exposed. She'd been deprioritized. And the quiet realization that no one was stepping in to stabilize her reputation settled in slowly. The way gravity does once you realize the ground you stood on was never guaranteed. She used to believe control was something you demonstrated. She was learning what happens when it's simply withdrawn. Isolation doesn't arrive with silence. It arrives with noise that goes unanswered. She filled the house with it at first. Calls taken on speaker. Meetings scheduled late. Movement meant to prove momentum. I moved through the same rooms without reacting, like a fixture that had stopped responding to touch. I was home more often, technically, just not available. She tried to re-establish routine. Left notes on the counter. Asked what time I'd be back. Mentioned meals she could make if I wanted. The words were practical, almost careful, like someone testing whether a bridge would still hold weight. I didn't reject any of it. I also didn't lean in. At work, my presence sharpened. Fewer words. Cleaner decisions. People adjusted around me without prompting. The secondary object ran smoothly, and my name began circulating in a different way. Not visible. Reliable. The kind of reputation that doesn't need reinforcement. She noticed the contrast. One night, she waited up. No laptop. No phone. Just the light on in the kitchen. She asked if we could talk. Not about us. About how things felt off. About how she didn't recognize the space between us anymore. I listened. I didn't fill the pauses. That was new for her. Silence had always been a tool she used. Now it wasn't responding. She said she felt alone even when I was there. I didn't deny it. After that, she stopped inviting people over. The house lost its performative order. Shoes stayed by the door. Dishes lingered. The kind of small disarray that signals no one's watching. I was watching, not to monitor her, to confirm my position. I existed adjacent to her life, not inside it. I left early, came back late. When I spoke, it was for logistics. Schedules. Bills. Neutral ground. She tried once to reach for me in bed. Not urgent. Tentative. I didn't pull away. I also didn't respond. The next morning, she acted like it hadn't happened. Her messages to friends grew longer. Explanatory. She checked her phone more often, waiting for replies that came slower each day. She started pacing when calls ended quickly. She asked if I was seeing someone else. I said no. That answer unsettled her more than a lie would have, because it meant the absence wasn't being redirected. It was being contained. I became something fixed in her environment. Present. Unreachable. No longer responsive to cues she'd relied on for years. By the time she realized I wasn't withholding affection to negotiate its return, but operating without the need for it at all, the isolation had already settled into her posture. She wasn't abandoned. She was surrounded by someone who had already left the conversation. The confrontation didn't happen when she planned it. It happened when she ran out of ways to manage around me. She waited until a Sunday morning, the kind she used to reserve for resets. No alarms. No meetings. She made coffee and sat across from me at the table like we were about to negotiate terms. She said we needed to clear the air. Not emotionally. Structurally. She talked about distance as if it were a misunderstanding. About cycles. About how strong relationships sometimes require recalibration. She said she missed the way I used to look at her, the way I used to check in, the way I used to want her. She said she missed the old me. I let her finish. I didn't mirror her language. I didn't correct the framing. I didn't remind her where the shift started. I stayed still, hands flat on the table, posture neutral. That unsettled her. She adjusted, asked direct questions. Whether I was angry, whether I was planning to leave, whether this was about someone else. I answered only what was asked. Short, accurate, no elaboration. I wasn't angry. I wasn't seeing anyone else. I wasn't planning anything she needed to prepare for. The lack of narrative threw her off. She was used to reactions she could work with. This wasn't resistance. It was absence. She brought up Mark then, not defensively, carefully. Said his situation had become complicated. Said people were misinterpreting things. Said lines had blurred and that maybe she hadn't realized how certain choices might land. I didn't respond. She waited. I stood up, rinsed my cup, and told her I had to head in early. Not as an escape. As a fact. That was the moment she understood this wasn't a conversation she could steer back to familiarity. There was no leverage left. No urgency on my side. She followed me to the door, not physically blocking it, just close enough to feel the shift. She said she didn't recognize me anymore. I told her that made sense. She asked if I still cared. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have one. Because answering would have re-entered a game I'd already exited. At work that day, nothing followed me. No distraction. No wait. I moved through decisions with clarity. Signed off on plans that extended months out. My future wasn't abstract anymore. When I came home that night, she was quiet. Watching me like someone studies a locked door, trying to remember what used to open it. She didn't push again. She didn't have to. The confrontation she'd been bracing for never arrived. What arrived instead was something colder and final. The realization that the man she was speaking to no longer required her understanding to keep moving forward. Her collapse wasn't loud. It didn't come with crying or accusations. It came with small failures she wasn't used to having. She missed a deadline. Not a critical one, but enough to be noticed. A follow-up email went unanswered longer than it should have. A meeting she usually dominated ended without her input because she arrived late and the room didn't pause. She told me about it that evening, standing in the kitchen like she was reporting an anomaly. She said things felt unstable, that people seemed distracted, that momentum was harder to maintain. I acknowledged it without comment. Mark's name stopped appearing altogether. Not replaced, removed, as if the system had quietly decided he no longer mattered enough to reference. That absence did more damage than any announcement could have. She felt it. Her phone stayed in her hand longer. She refreshed feeds that hadn't changed. She reread old messages, searching for tone shifts she might have missed. The confidence she once carried like armor started slipping at the edges. She began remembering things out loud. Moments she'd dismissed before. Nights I'd come home exhausted and still listened. Times I'd adjusted schedules so she could travel. The way I used to stand behind her at events, not speaking, just present. She mentioned those things without context, like data points that had only just become relevant. I didn't respond. The house changed again. Not messy, empty, not in objects, but in energy. She stopped hosting, stopped suggesting plans, stopped narrating her life. One night, she sat on the floor of the living room instead of the couch. She said she didn't know when everything had started slipping. Said she felt like she'd misjudged something important. I stayed where I was. She asked if I remembered when we used to feel aligned. When things felt simple. I didn't answer. Because alignment requires two people facing the same direction. And I was already somewhere else. The next week, she lost a contract she'd assumed was secure. No drama. Just a polite email choosing another consultant. She reread it several times, like the meaning might change. That night, she finally cried. Quietly. In the bathroom. The door closed, but the sound carried. I didn't intervene. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. What she was feeling wasn't heartbreak. It was recalibration. The delayed impact of choices she'd framed as controlled experiments. She came out later and looked at me like I might anchor her again. I didn't move. Because by then, the pattern was complete. The authority she'd borrowed had dissolved. The room no longer adjusted for her. And the man she once measured herself against had already reorganized his life, without her at the center. She wasn't losing me in that moment. She was realizing she already had. She said it on a Tuesday night, like it was something she'd been rehearsing. Not dramatic. Not broken. Just tired in a way I hadn't seen before. She said she missed the old me. She didn't say it as an accusation. She said it like a diagnosis. Like naming a loss once you're sure it isn't temporary. I was sitting at the table going over next month's rotation schedule. The kind of planning that assumes continuity. I didn't look up right away. Not to ignore her. To finish what I was doing. When I did look up, she was standing near the counter, arms crossed loosely, posture uncertain. No strategy left in it. No framing. She said she missed how I used to show up. How I used to try. How I used to look at her like she mattered. I didn't interrupt. She said she knew she'd crossed a line. Not all at once. In steps. Tests that turned into habits. Habits that turned into distance. She said she hadn't realized how much she'd leaned on my steadiness until it stopped responding. She said she didn't recognize herself lately. I closed the folder and set it aside. I told her I hadn't disappeared. I told her I'd just stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. That was all. No recap. No defense. No inventory of effort. I didn't need her agreement for it to be true. She waited for more. An opening. A condition. Something to negotiate against. I stood up and grabbed my jacket. She asked if that meant I was leaving. I told her it meant I was going to bed early. I had a long shift. That answer landed harder than any ultimatum ever could. In the days that followed, she changed. Not performatively. Fundamentally. Less correction. More listening. She stopped evaluating and started observing. She gave space without trying to fill it. I noticed. I didn't reward it. What she didn't understand was that the old version of me she missed was built around accommodation. Around earning closeness. Around proving value. That man didn't exist anymore. What existed now was someone who moved when things made sense and stayed still when they didn't. Someone who didn't need proximity to feel intact. Whether she adjusted enough to meet that version wasn't something I rushed to decide. I wasn't punishing her. I was finally living without negotiating my place. And for the first time, she understood that peace wasn't something she could grant or withhold. It was something I'd already earned elsewhere.